I know Pastor got a new camera, so that might be what he's trying to figure out.
Well, it is still trying to get it all set up, so I'm going to be using the just the computer camera until it's done. So you may see a shift in perspectives halfway through, depending on how long this takes.
Well, that is an interesting perspective. Didn't anticipate that one.
Yep, that's the computer perspective, but eventually I'll hopefully get a head-on perspective.
And when you let him out of the house with that hairdo,
Yeah. She doesn't get much of a say in that. All right. All right. We have Tim here with us in person, and then we have the Tegans on Zoom, as well as Emma on Zoom. So we got a good number of people here. I will be peeking on my little camera thing here every once in a while just to see if it's almost done so I can switch. But we can get started without it, and I will switch it if it becomes available so I can see how it looks and if it works better. But I also need to make sure that I have all of the links ready for you guys who are watching online, joining online, making sure that you can follow along with class, because last time I forgot to send it until later on. So I want to make sure I at least have it. All right. We might be able to soon switch cameras. We'll see what happens. But we will get started, and if anyone joins us later on, great. If not, that's also fine. But good evening, everybody. We watched for today the final episode of season 3. So it was a very exciting episode. We got to see Jesus doing a lot of teaching. Then we saw him feeding the 5,000, and then we saw Peter and him walking on water. And so we're going to really be talking about that. We're also going to talk about something that was happening in the background, and that is the purification ritual that Eden was going through at the time due to the miscarriage that she had had earlier on in the season. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about the psalm that was mentioned there, which was also in the episode, both at the beginning and at the end, and really seeing how it all ties together into the episode, how they were good bookends for this particular episode. But to get started, let's do a quick little summary. So this episode actually just picks up straight away from where the last episode ended. So Jesus and his disciples, except for Simon and John, had gone yes, my microphone is working. Everything seems to be working. Okay. Everything seems to be working just fine. Perfect. All right. Am I coming through clearly? Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I just got a notification saying everything had stopped working. So I just wanted to make sure that everything was still working. But yeah, so they're all the way up in the Decapolis, and Simon and John finally catch up. Is everything freezing for everyone else? Okay, there we go. I think it's just because I have that thing downloading in the background. It's slowing everything down. But as long as you guys can still hear me during that time, I'm okay with that. If there's a little bit of freezing for my camera, because eventually I'll switch and that'll be the end of it. In fact, I think it's done. Let's see if it's ready for it to be used. Okay, not yet. Hopefully soon I'll be able to switch cameras and we'll have just a better video. But so Simon and John get there, and Jesus then begins to talk with his disciples, basically ignoring everyone else because he wants to address an issue with his disciples, talk to them about what their goal is here. And he's doing it in front of everyone. He knows everyone is listening, but he wants to specifically be talking to his disciples. And during that time, there is a man who had injured his leg. And so Jesus ends up healing that man. And that man then is able to run off. And he goes and tells everyone else in that area. That's better. He goes out and tells everybody in the area about what Jesus has done. And now more and more people are starting to come. And Jesus is starting to teach them. But then he realizes that he can't be heard. So he has all the people gathered into groups and he begins to teach them. He teaches them about the sower and the seed. And he is not just addressing Jews, he is addressing a whole range of people, Jews and Gentiles. And he shows a great knowledge and understanding of a lot of their different religions, as well as showing compassion on all the people there, making sure that they don't feel as if he is against them and that he is their enemy, but rather that he is there to talk with them, hear what they have to say, and teach them what he has to teach them. Then he continues teaching and teaching, and then it becomes night. And already by that time, they guess that there is about a few thousand people present. They don't have an exact number, but there's a large amount of people. And this gets the disciples already starting to be worried because these people have been living outside of a city for a few days now. And now they are sitting out here listening to Jesus teach, and they don't have food. And so they're wondering, how on earth are these people going to get food that they need? The next morning, Jesus continues teaching the people, and finally the disciples decide it's time for us to address the main issue, which is, where are we going to get food for these people? And Simon is angrily, but still trying to keep the disciples in line, says, if Jesus wants to do something about it, he will do it. We don't need to worry about trying to figure that out. Just let Jesus deal with it on his own time. And soon enough, Jesus, he goes and addresses this issue with his disciples, saying, yes, we do need to get these people some food. And they say, where are we going to get food for all these people? And that's when a young boy comes forward and says, well, I have 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And Jesus says, that's all I need. And he ends up feeding all of the people to the point that they are satisfied. And this greatly upsets Simon because, as we saw in the last episode, he was dealing with the issue of his wife having had a miscarriage, and Jesus didn't do anything about it, and he feels as if this is all Jesus' fault. Then, after this feeding, Jesus sends his disciples away on a boat that Simon had found, and he says, I'm going to go off and pray. During this all, a man has gone back to Jerusalem, told Shemuel about what's going on out there, and he and a couple other Pharisees go out there to find Jesus, and Shemuel gets the chance to speak with Jesus in private. And that's all we hear about those two. Whereas the disciples, they are trying to get across the Sea of Galilee, rowing in a storm, but they aren't getting anywhere and they're getting frustrated and they just want to get back to shore. They didn't care where they got back to shore, they just wanted to get back to a shore. And that's when they see a figure walking on the water. At first, they think it is a ghost, but then Jesus says, "It's me." And this is where Simon says, "Well, if it is you, tell me to come out and walk on the water to you." And so Jesus calls him to walk out in faith, and Peter does so. But he begins to look around at the water, the storm that's going on around him, and he begins to sink. And it's at that moment that Jesus rescues him and says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And this brings to conclusion everything that's been going on with Simon throughout this series for this season, especially due to his wife's miscarriage. And running parallel to all of this, Eden is beginning to grieve and continue to grieve over this and is starting to try and figure out some things. And that's when she goes to the synagogue and meets with one of the teachers there who is a follower of Jesus, though in secret, Yusuf. And he reads to her Psalm 77, and she decides that she's going to be re-purified in the waters that had been tainted beforehand. And so during that time, she is now grieving, and she goes under the water, and they have it being parallel with Simon going under the water to show that both of them have been renewed in a way through Jesus. And they are praying and asking Jesus not to let them go. But that was the episode for today. Are there any questions or comments about this episode? Anything I left out that you want to talk about before we actually get into our discussion?
Just to verify, is Simon still upset with Jesus at this point?
He is upset with Jesus all the way up until he goes under the water. Even while he's walking on the water, he is yelling at Jesus, saying, "Why did you come all the way out to the Decapolis to help people when there is someone right here who needed your help and you ignored him?" And Jesus then says, "Well, I did this because you need to learn how to deal with hard things. It's going to only get harder from here, but I trust that you're going to be able to handle it in the future. But I needed you to go through this now so that you can do it in the future."
I guess that leads me to my next question then. Why would Peter have even challenged Jesus by saying, "If it is you, ask me to come out"?
Yep, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that, especially in light of what we see here. And it's really going to be, it's showing already where Simon's faith is. Because we saw it with the feeding of the 5,000 that he's like, if Jesus wants to do it, Jesus can do it. He can do whatever he wants. It doesn't matter. He can do whatever he wants. There is nothing that can stop him. And so that's really what he's doing, is that he's like, okay, fine, Jesus, I still trust that you are who you say you are, but I'm upset with you. And I want to come out to you and I want to have this conversation with you. Come and deal with me face to face, man to man, and deal with this. And that's really what he is trying to get at. He's trying to let out every problem that he's had and let it out on Jesus because he is mad at him because Jesus did nothing. Any other questions or comments? If not, then let me just send out this the Bible class for today. It's going to be a little bit of a longer one because we will be going through three things today. We will be going through Psalm 77. We'll be going through John's account of the feeding of the 5,000. And then we'll be going through Matthew's account of Simon walking on water. And I feel like those last two, they really fit together well, even though they are in different gospels. Both gospels actually have both of these accounts in them. In fact, the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the very few things that show up in all four gospels. But I think John's is the most interesting in regards to the details it includes, and Matthew's has a lot of really good, important details going on as well. But I'm assuming now everyone has opened up the worksheet for today. So we're going to start by reading Psalm 77. I will read all of the verses, and anyone is welcome to answer any of the questions. But let's get started with Psalm 77. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated, and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Then I thought, to this I will appeal. The years when the Lord Most High stretched out his right hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeem your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. All right, so what is the psalmist doing at the beginning of this psalm?
Honestly, he's being pretty arrogant and he's complaining. That
Yeah.
I didn't really like the beginning of the psalm at all.
Yeah, he's
Because of that. It's just like, who do you think you are?
yeah. Yeah, he's crying out to God to help him. He's just complaining about all the distress that he's in. And you see in those questions he's asking, he seems to be complaining about God. And what does the psalmist say it felt like God was doing in verse 4?
Keeping his eyes closed or from closing.
Yeah, it was almost as if God was stretching out his hands and keeping his eyes open and just not letting him sleep at all, making him just more and more miserable, it felt like to him. Now, I want us to look at verses 7 to 9, and I want us to answer those questions, but I want it to be answered in two different ways. First is in how this person might be feeling at that moment, this moment of deep despair that he is in. Answer it first from that perspective, and then we're going to answer it from the broader perspective of what the rest of the Bible says. But let's start by just answering those questions. Imagine being in such deep despair and having to answer these questions. So, the first question is, will the Lord reject forever? What might a person in deep despair say about that?
I think the problem with that is that he's assuming that the Lord is rejecting him. It's just a misunderstanding of scripture completely.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly feels like to him that the Lord has rejected him,
Which
and
is
it
not
feels like
true.
it's been forever.
Yeah,
Well, he's in despair though. Is that what you're saying? That's why he
Yeah,
feels that
yeah. I
way?
mean, if you read through those questions and you think about what it's like to be in deep despair, you can't help but feel like the answers are yes, the Lord does do this. The Lord has rejected me forever. The Lord has will never show me favor again. His unfailing love has vanished forever. His promises have failed for all time. And God has forgotten to be merciful, and in his anger, he has withheld compassion from me.
and see that in my mind, he's projecting what he thinks God is thinking, and it's completely wrong.
Yep,
So-
and that's the point I want to get at, because now let's look at it from the right perspective, keeping in mind what the rest of the Bible says. What is the answer to all these questions? No. The
That God
answer is
will
no.
do. Yeah,
The Lord has
exactly.
not rejected us forever. He will show his favor again. His unfailing love hasn't vanished forever. His promises haven't failed. He hasn't forgotten his mercy, and he hasn't withheld his compassion from us. That's the reality of what is happening, and that's the truth all the time. But in that moment of deep despair, a person might feel that the answer is yes to all of these questions. It certainly feels like the Lord has abandoned me forever. And we actually can sort of see that. Let's compare verses 1 to 6 and compare it with the last 11 verses with how the person is thinking and what the person is doing. So look at those first 6 verses and then look at the remaining 11 verses after verse 9. So verses 10 to 20. 10 to 20. And notice any similarities and differences. Yeah. So he's whining in the first 6. Yeah. Yeah, and in the last 11, he's sort of like, here's a list of all the miracles God has ever done, mainly just focusing on the one where God split the Red Sea and allowed the people of Israel to cross there. What other difference do you see?
I guess in the first section, he's relying on his emotions, which you're not supposed to do. And then the second part, he's relying on the truth of the word.
Yep.
And using that to reassure him. So reassure himself.
Yep. In the first half, he's like, this is how I'm feeling, God. You're not doing anything for me. And then the second half, he goes, well, wait, let me actually think about everything God has ever done for his people. But now, one thing I want to point out is look at verse 2 and compare that with verse 10.
Are you saying that in verse 2, it was almost like he was refusing to be comforted? Versus in verse 10, well, it just says that the Lord stretched out his right hand.
And that's the point I want to get to. Notice in verse 2, he says, I stretched out my hand untiringly. I'm reaching out for you, God, where are you?
Well,
And then
God was
later
there.
on,
It
he
admits
goes,
This is to be comforted.
yeah, he would not be comforted because he's reaching out for God and he's not finding God where he wants him to be. Whereas when he thinks back on what God has done, he remembers, no. God is the one who must stretch out his hand to me and take hold of me. And that's where we find our comfort, in the fact that even if we reach out and we can't find God, God is reaching out and grabbing us. He is the one who keeps us safe. We can't do anything on our own. If we listen to our emotions, we can't be comforted. In fact, we can refuse to be comforted. But if we allow God to work through his word, then we receive comfort. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, so are there any questions about Psalm 77? Any other verses? I just wanted to touch on those few things because I think it really hits a lot on what we see in the episode, as well as what we're going to talk about in the next two sections.
The only question I have is, do we know who wrote Psalm 77? Just out of
Yes,
curiosity?
I just left that part out because it was not important. It is a man named Asaph. He is
Oh, okay.
well known for writing a number of psalms. He was the chief music director for David. So when David became king, he decided, hey, it's probably a good idea that we have music for the temple. And so he assigned people for that job, and Asaph was the head guy. He was also, for Emma, he was the percussionist of the group.
Did they ever explain, like, is he actually writing this from his personal experience, or is he writing it like a
It
song?
doesn't say anything
lyrics?
about it. A lot of the Psalms, it just
Okay.
says, this is who wrote it, this is who he wrote it for, and sometimes it says, and it's written to this tune. And you're like, okay, thank you. But that's about it.
So-
There's
so even
very
though he's
few
using
Psalms that
first-
actually say, this is when it was written.
Right. And then, so even though he's using first person, is he actually writing it for David then?
We
So,
don't
like,
know. We
is
don't
the
know when
I-
he
oh,
wrote
okay.
it or who
Okay.
he wrote it for. We know he wrote it for another guy. What was
I just didn't know if he was speaking about a specific thing, or if he's just writing this for people to use to refer back to whenever they're feeling distressed. Or
It
if
could
this,
go either way. Well, with a lot of these psalms, it could go either way. A lot of the time, though, it was usually something that was going on in their lives, especially when we look at David, who a lot of his psalms do mention why he wrote it. Psalm 51 was written after Nathan came to talk to him about the adultery he committed with Bathsheba. Psalm 52 is when when David is running away from Saul. There's just a number of them where he mentions when he is writing it. There's just a number of those, and there's even there's at least, I'm looking in just the nearby verses or the nearby psalms. There's about 8 or 9 of them already that say this is when David wrote them.
awesome.
And so it's just, we don't get it from everybody. David occasionally tells us, hey, this is what had just happened to me when I wrote this psalm.
Right.
And a lot of times you can actually see that playing out in the psalm. Like, for instance, there's one where he says, this is when I was in this city. And if you look at the story of when he was in that city, he was acting as if he was crazy. And he talks about that in the psalm.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, are there any other questions about Psalm 77 before we jump into John chapter 6? Not seeing any more, so let's jump into John chapter 6. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming near toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. All right, so in the beginning of this text, Jesus and his disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee. And what do the people do?
They follow.
Yeah, they go around the sea and they catch up with him on the other side. Now, what does John reveal about the question Jesus asked Philip?
That Jesus was kind of asking a rhetorical question because he already knew what he was going to do.
Yeah, he already knew what he was going to do. He knew what was going to happen, but he chose to ask this question anyway, saying, "Hey, I want you to provide food." This was a test to get them to say, "Well, Jesus, what are you going to do? You just tell us what we need to do in order to help you do what you need to get done." And what did Jesus tell his disciples to do after the people had eaten all they wanted? Yep, to gather it all up so that none would be wasted. And how did the people respond to the feeding of the 5,000 men?
They saw it as a sign that he is the prophet of the one to come.
Yep, he is the prophet, he is the Messiah. And what did they want to do?
They
It's-
wanted to see
make-
more signs, right?
Yep, they wanted to see more signs, but they also wanted him to force him to become king.
Mhm.
That's why Jesus withdrew. Now, this is more of a defense, an apologetic sort of question that I'm going to be asking here, which is a defense for the Bible. So some people want to discredit the Bible by saying that it was written hundreds of years later by people who did not live in the region, did not personally know Jesus, and were not present at any of these events. Basically, the whole thing is a fiction or an exaggeration of what actually happened. However, in this account of the feeding of the 5,000, 2 details stand out, namely the grass and the barley loaves. How might those 2 small details disprove this idea?
Does it have something to do with like how the barley was used?
Well, it's nothing to do with how the barley was used, more the fact that barley loaves are specified, what type of bread it was.
So you would have had to have been there to see him give thanks. And then, of course, to know that that region had grassy area for people to sit.
Yeah, exactly. You would have had to have been there in order for you to know those details. This is something that in biblical studies is called undesigned coincidence, where the puzzle pieces fit too well together for it to be a made-up story. The fact that in a deserty area that there was plenty of grass for people to sit on, that would not be something that anyone could just make up. You would have to know that, hey, in that area, in the springtime, which it says here is the Jewish Passover festival, which takes place in the spring, that there would be grass there. The only way you would know that is if you had at least been to that place and knew that can happen from time to time, that this grass can be covering a large area in the spring. On top of that, to know that specifically it was barley bread, that is a type of detail that a normal person, if they're just passing on or making up a story, it wouldn't have been as necessary, especially considering that John is the latest of the four Gospels. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke just say loaves. They do not mention barley loaves. They just say loaves. So it's just these two details, these two very small details show that this cannot be a made-up story or written by someone hundreds of years later who had never been to those areas. Because if it had, they wouldn't have gotten the detail about the grass, and they would not have mentioned the fact that it was barley loaves, considering that everyone else was just saying it was bread that was available.
Well, and one of the things that apologetics, I don't remember the guy's name, but he was saying that when you have eyewitness testimony, if everybody's testimony is the exact same, that's when you know that they've conspired to have the exact same. So the fact that the other three only say loaves and then John says barley loaves shows, because you're going to have slight differences. You're going to have personal individual people focusing on their own version of what happened. But as long as the overall event is the same, then you have continuity, I guess would be a good word.
Yep.
To know that it's true. But you know, it's like if you have a bunch of teenagers who all got caught shoplifting and they all have the same story, then you know that they are making it up.
Yep,
You know?
they all conspired, especially if it's exactly the same word
Yep.
for word. Yep, and that, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. There's a police officer who mentioned that when he was studying the resurrection account. He said
Yeah.
it actually is what made me a Christian, because the four accounts all had different details without them being really conflicting with each other. These
Yeah,
were
I think
people who actually saw what they said they saw.
I think his last name was Wallace, but I can't remember his first name.
I
And
think
he
you're right.
also said that
I can't think of it either.
yeah, that Jesus appeared to so many people after he was resurrected, that if and all of these things were written down, that if there were still people alive. So if somebody had written something that was not true, then there would have been firsthand account people saying, no, that's not how it happened.
Yep, exactly. Are there any questions about John chapter 6 before we move on to our last section from Matthew? I'm not seeing any more questions. So let's jump into this next section from Matthew chapter 14, which is Jesus walking on water and ultimately Simon walking on water. So for Matthew chapter 14, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone. and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come out to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So this account takes place after Jesus feeds the 5,000. And that's in both Matthew, Mark, and John. All three of them record the same account immediately following the feeding of the 5,000. Luke does not. So what happened at the end of John that may have made Jesus want to send the disciples away so that he could be alone to pray? This will require you to look back at the previous thing we just went through, because it's the connection between those two. Yeah,
It
he
was-
wanted to send them away. Yeah, Renee?
Oh, no, it looked like that is because they wanted to force him to be king, so he withdrew.
Yeah, the people wanted him to be king, so he was dismissing the crowd, saying, "No, you guys go away." And you can imagine that would be with 5,000 men there. This would be a very exhausting task, both physically and spiritually, and would have weighed heavily on Jesus. And so he just was like, "You guys start heading across. I need a moment to myself to pray." And he did that very often, where he, after a large crowd of people would come to him, he would then go off alone to pray, thus proving that introverts are better than extroverts. Because Jesus had to go away to be recharged after being with so many people.
As an introvert, I approve this message.
I'm doing it to spite my wife.
I'll see myself out now.
But now, what was going on with the disciples while Jesus was praying? Yeah, they were fighting a storm that had come up on them, and they were trying to get back to shore. Now, how does Peter's response to Jesus already show the strength of Peter's faith?
He already knows that the Lord is going to help him walk on the water if he's saying that he'll come to him.
Yep. He has faith enough to be able to say, "Look, I trust you. If you want me to come out there, I can walk on the water." But considering what Jesus ultimately says about his faith, "You of little faith," how do we see that that is already true with what Peter says?
Is it because he didn't believe that was, because he goes, "If it's really you, tell me."
If it's really you, Jesus, well, then you tell me to come out there on the water. He needed proof that Jesus could do it, that it really was Jesus. He was doubting. It's a small doubt. I mean, considering that he probably couldn't actually see physically that it was Jesus. He just sees a shadow out there walking on the water saying, "Hey, don't worry, it's me. You know exactly who this is." But it's possible that they couldn't actually fully see who it was. And so Peter's just saying, "Well, if it really is you, prove it to me and let me walk on the water to you." But Peter could have easily just said, well, Lord, if it's you, I'm coming out onto the water. And just done it without having a doubt in his mind, just walked out to Jesus, and Jesus would have kept him on the water. But now let's talk about the episode today and what we have looked at today. So, in light of the episode for today, how does the psalm and the story of Peter walking on the water really fit together perfectly as a wrap up of the storyline of Simon in The Chosen?
Can you restate the question, please? One of my kids came up when you were asking it.
Yep, that's fine. So we had in the episode we have this account of Peter walking on the water, and we also have Psalm 77 repeated a number of times in the episode. So looking at those two things, how does the psalm and the story of Peter walking on the water really fit together perfectly as a ramp up of Simon's storyline in The Chosen? So how is it that those two biblical accounts, the biblical account of Peter walking on the water and the psalm from Psalm 77, how does that really work together to create a good wrap up for the storyline of Simon in season 3? Yeah. It's about having faith in God.
Because over the last few episodes, he's really been detached and angry. And so this is showing that he's been suffering the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah. You can almost look at these the Simon in The Chosen. You can read the verses from Psalm 77 and say, wow, he's really in those first 9 verses still, where he's in his deep despair, going, God, why did you let this happen? You must have abandoned me. You must have given me up. Which makes sense. This is why in the end he says, don't let me go. Don't let me go. Because that was the biggest thing on his mind, was that maybe this is not really what I'm supposed to be doing. Maybe he made a mistake. Maybe I'm not supposed to be here. And that's what he's trying to tell me. Maybe he has rejected me. And Jesus is like, no, I have not rejected you. I allow hard things to happen so that you rely on me. All right. Are there any other questions about Matthew chapter 14 or any of the other readings we went through? If not, then let us close with prayer. Dear Lord, as we walk through life, we are buffeted by storms, and very often we take our eyes off of you. Allow these words from your word to strengthen our faith and remind us of the true source of all good things, that is you. You give us food to eat, but you also give us food for our souls. Strengthen us each and every day to live a life focused on you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Have a great rest of your week. I will see you guys on Sunday.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye.
Good night.